All right, welcome everyone to this week's edition of Redistricting Radar. This week we have myself and Jared Stone on. Harrison won't be able to make it this week, but that's fine. We've got a lot of states to go over here, some really interesting stuff, and really excited to have Jared on, the Nevada expert. Really knowledgeable about the state, and will give us some good insight into what we might expect from their redistricting process and how that all works. So yeah, before we get into things here, I guess we'll go ahead and talk about. We'll lead off with Nevada because I think this is probably going to be the most interesting of these three states. Not to say New Mexico and New Hampshire won't be interesting, but out of the bunch, Nevada is the one with the most competitive. Or Nevada is the one with the most competitive legislature. Competitive situation overall with their delegation at the moment. So, what are your initial thoughts on kind of the structure we might see for this redistricting process? I know I can explain the details of it, but obviously Democratic control this decade. The previous decade, you had the governor, Brian Sandoval, and he had a Democratic legislature, so they had to produce a compromise map. This decade, it's entirely a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor.
Right. Yeah. So given the fact that we don't have any split control anymore, and the state is currently under a Democratic trifecta, Democrats are really going to be looking at shoring up their incumbents and producing three decently safe seats for themselves within the state that would allow their current incumbents to be able to withstand, potentially a red wave or anything of the like in 2022. So the thing about Nevada is that it remains a pretty inelastic state. As we saw after the 2020 election, a lot of the results that we saw in the state in 2016 remained pretty stagnant in 2020, even as some of the trends that have to do with the urban, rural, and suburban shifts did appear in some cases. And so when we're talking about the two most competitive districts in the state, namely the third and the fourth, they succumbed in some ways to some of the national trends that we saw, but in other ways they remained quite stable. For instance, the third district, which was a Trump district, Trump won it by around 1 point in 2016, was very narrowly won by Biden by around 0.2%. So it's definitely not a district that cannot be competitive under the right circumstances, but Democrats will be wanting to shore up their incumbent, Susie Lee, who's sort of business-oriented mainstream Democrat. For all intents and purposes, they'll want to give her some sort of a leeway with that. And then you have the fourth district, which is currently repped by Stephen Horsford. And that has become something of a competitive district recently because Trump's gains among minority voters, particularly Hispanic voters throughout the country, was something that was felt in Las Vegas too. And so what you had in the Clinton +5 district turned into a Biden +4 district in the case of the fourth district. And so Democrats are going to have to really be careful when they think about redistricting. But if they pull their cards in the right way, they, I believe, will be able to come up with something of a relatively stable 3-to-1 map.
And for those who aren't familiar with the current map, I'll go ahead and pull it up here. We'll go ahead and go over Nevada at the moment. So I'm going to keep mispronouncing the state name, but
Okay.
But one thing I want to note here that I find interesting is that in every election since 2008, Nevada has actually gotten more competitive. It's gotten closer in every election since 2008, but it's not actually gone to the Republican side. It went from Hillary won it by about 2.42%, while Biden won it by about 2.39%. This was after Romney's gains in 2012, after a frankly embarrassing showing for Republicans in 2008. Really the low of Democratic performance in Nevada. One thing to keep in mind here with the state and with the map as a whole is that Nevada is one of the most urbanized states in the country. Most of the population lives in Clark County, and the rest of the population mostly lives around Carson City and Reno. These counties around here, which are closer to the California side of the state. Very few people live in these rural counties right here. So even though the fourth looks geographically quite, broad, quite rural, most of the population really lives in these two portions, over there and in Nye County, but also in Clark County, the portions north of Las Vegas. So we'll kind of go over the delegation here real quick. Dina Titus, her seat is in the first district, Las Vegas. She was narrowly defeated in 2010, if I recall right, when Nevada had 3 districts, and then came back in the safely Democratic Las Vegas-based seat. Theoretically, Nevada has enough people for a majority-minority seat, and this is relatively majority-minority. It's not majority Hispanic, but it's definitely more so. Although you'll notice here, it did see a shift towards Trump of about 3 percentage points compared to the previous election. The second is the Republican seat. It's, I mean, again, most of the population is based around the urban portion, but these rural portions definitely make it a Republican seat more so than it already is in that area. Susie Lee in the third we mentioned before, she has the seat which is the southern portion of Clark County, so it goes from the areas around Arizona or around the Bullhead City all the way up to these areas like Henderson and around here. It's been one of the most competitive at the presidential level. And finally, Stephen Hortsford's seat, which is again looks rural, looks Republican, but in reality, it leans more Democratic than other seats. You compare this to the previous maps. Nevada has actually gained congressional districts in multiple decades. It had 2 seats in 1980 and the 90s. It actually one of the examples of an embedded congressional district, just based entirely in Las Vegas. Then gained a third seat in the 2000s, and then finally the fourth seat this decade. It did not gain an additional seat, but it is one of the faster growing states in the country, in terms of population growth, constant, especially around Clark County. So overall, I think we'll have multiple maps to show here. I drew a map more of a least change map in a way, but tried to give Democrats a little bit more of an edge, particularly in the third district, which obviously with the Latino gains the Republicans have been seeing, it's going to be hard to hold that first district as a majority minority seat, while also dragging the rest of those seats, dragging enough of Las Vegas into the first and third, or sorry, a third and fourth, to render them less competitive than usual. I mean, frankly, Susie Lee has held on remarkably in a very, very competitive seat. And I don't know if they can trust that holding for additional terms in a more Republican midterm. I mean, we'll notice here, very, very competitive, within 1 point in all of the last few presidential elections, the last 3 of them. So a phenomenally competitive district. I mean, there's not a whole lot of seats you can say like that are consistently that competitive overall. But yeah, so do you have any additional comments on the state? What you're kind of seeing. I mean, obviously the second is going to stay pretty similar, but from my initial draw, I think it's actually going to take in a little bit more of the rural portions compared to the previous decade. A lot more, in fact. If you look at this one, right, if you look at the actual map, it cuts off at Eureka, Lander, Churchill, and Elko. In mine, I think it would cut off more around Nye County. Nye County and have White Pine in it as well. So the fourth would lose some of that rural area in most maps.
Exactly. Yeah. And my map is the same, because the second, in comparison to the other districts in the state, is not growing as rapidly, even with population growth in the Reno metropolitan area. And so, as you said, yeah, I mean, the second district is going to have to pretty much grow. If you wanted to contain Reno and not have any districts slicing through it, which is not the case with one of my maps, as I'll show you soon. But if you want to have a Reno-based district that extends into rural areas, it's going to have to go pretty much towards Nye County and Lincoln County, so pretty much towards the outskirts of Las Vegas. So really is a district that takes up a vast majority of the state's land area, if you want to keep it that way.
And for those who aren't familiar with Nye County, it's the most heavily populated of Nevada's rural interior counties. I mean, this is a county that's also more competitive than a lot of these, but certainly in terms of population, it's much more populated than a lot of the rural areas, which I'll try and find a map to show you, or to show our viewers, just how urbanized Nevada is. You look at it geographically, most of it is owned by the federal government. So right off the bat, not habitable for land population, but also it's desert. It's not the most hospitable areas. Whereas, you have these big cities in Reno and particularly in Las Vegas. Yeah, if you look at this right here, I mean, most of these areas have a population of less than 1 person per square mile. That is hilariously underpopulated, to put it lightly. And you can see where the people actually live, the Nye County portion where they live down in that corner instead of up in the northern area, and some other scattered communities throughout the state. If you want to learn more about kind of these scenarios we've been talking about, we did an excellent episode of the Map Room on Old Bull TV where we discussed the state in more detail. But just since showing you that, I think we can kind of go into our maps. So if you want to show your maps first, I only have one map, and I can show that at the end. But viewers would probably be benefited by seeing your maps, especially. You know,
Yeah, sure. Let me.
especially relative to the previous decade.
Mhm. Okay. All right. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, I can
Can you
see it.
see
Let
my
me pull it up here. Yep, there we go.
Great. So you can see, so I made a few maps, but I'll explain them all in detail. So one of the propositions that some Nevada Democrats have in mind is in order to create the possibility of having three relatively stable Democratic seats, they'd have to create a Republican vote sink. And to do that most maximally, what you do is you basically have to take pretty much all this rural land in all of these rural counties, 15 out of 17 counties are pretty much this rural area. And then you have to create something of a bridge that connects urban Reno as well as urban Sparks, which are Democratic areas in Washoe County, down to Democratic areas in Clark County. So this is basically what I'm demonstrating with this first map. Now, it's hard to create a really visually appealing map that tries to do this, but what I did is I tried to at least have some sort of direction and directive when I was making this map. And so if you look at the border here between this Republican vote sink, which is obviously just connecting all of the Republican areas in the state to this Democratic leaning seat, you'll see that it's actually connected, or the border actually runs along this important corridor, which is the I-95, which is basically how people travel and how freight and not freight, but cars and trucks and things like how they travel from Las Vegas to Reno. So really is one of the most important corridors in the state, just given how expansive and how rural it is in general. But basically, if Democrats want to do a 3-1 map, they might want to do something like this. So again, you have this vast rural area that is confined within the red. Even when you look at Reno and Washoe County, you can see a lot of its ruby red suburbs, as well as surrounding counties, are confined to this expansive red second district. And this district would probably still be repped by Mark Ambidet, although he is considering running for a statewide position like governor. He does have under his belt the fact that he's never lost Washoe County, which is this county right here, in any of its congressional runs. And that's quite unusual for a Republican because it is a very leftward trending county. In fact, Trump did a lot worse there in 2020 than in 2016. That's similar with some of the surrounding counties as well.
And Clark was where Trump gained, but the losses in Washoe were really what sank him. But the Clark gains, that's the opposite of what people had expected. If Republicans were going to regain strength in Nevada, people thought they would do it around Washoe, not over in the more urbanizing, growing, very, very populated Clark County area.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. Someone like Joe Heck in 2016 was able to win Washoe County. And that was the same with some people who ran statewide, even in 2018. For instance, the current Secretary of State, Barbara Sadowski, won Washoe County resoundingly. But Trump had some real issues there. And so if Republicans want to win in the state in 2022, they're really going to have to look at Clark County. So let's look at Clark County now. So within my red Republican vote sink district, I put a few communities of interest that I think would be best suited in a red district. One of them is part of Henderson, which is the second largest city in Nevada. It has some very Republican communities, especially in areas like Green Valley Ranch, as well as Anthem, which is where a lot of retirees and senior citizens live. Boulder City is I would say an ex-urban community of Las Vegas that's near the border. Hoover Dam is probably the most popular site there, but it's another very Republican city that I think would be best put in a red district. And then aside from Pahrump, which I decided to put in a red district because it is, relatively speaking, a rather populous red area, given the fact that it is in a very, very sparse area of the state. I also decided to put the community of Summerlin South, which is historically a Republican city, inside this district because I felt like that would sort of allow it to connect to other communities of interest, like Henderson, which is another sort of traditionally Republican and rather wealthy area. Going to some of the other districts, you have this bridge from the blue areas of Washoe County. It swoops in, takes in part of Carson City and Douglas County, but that's just sort of how it has to work if it wants to be successful. It goes down nobody lives in these areas that I'm showing you right now. But it finally gets into Las Vegas, and it has to swoop down into some Democratic-leaning territory, which is what you'll get if you go to a place like Spring Valley here or Enterprise down here. These are Democratic-leaning areas that are growing relatively quickly. But that's sort of how you get this blue tint to the district. And given the state's elasticity, and given the fact that Washoe is rocketing to the left while other parts of the state are moving right, I have little concerns that this district is suddenly going to become a Republican one. And then looking at the other districts, you have Stephen Horsford's district, which is in this darker shade of blue, sort of surrounds the first district right here. And by the way, just to give you some context, this is an incumbency protection map as well. Susie Lee in the third district lives within this light blue district. Stephen Horsford lives in this darker blue district, which would have trended right, but it takes in some left trending areas in Henderson to sort of balance it out and keep it stable. And then finally, you have this urban core district, which is Las Vegas. And at this point, it'd be represented by Dina Titus. However, Dina Titus is being floated as a contender for the ambassadorship to Greece. And so, in fact, quite recently, you had another contender, a progressive named Amy Vilela, who tossed herself into the ring for this district. And so there's a good chance that she might be a representative for this district come 2023, or maybe even earlier. And fortunately for her, being a progressive and a Hispanic woman who sort of has ties to those communities, this district is actually 50+1 majority Hispanic in total population, which is rather difficult to get in Las Vegas, even despite the fact that there's a huge Hispanic community here, but they are rather dispersed across the city with a few exceptions. And so it is somewhat difficult to get something like this, but fortunately, in my case, it was possible. So that's one map I have. And I'll rather quickly gloss over some of the other ones just to show you some important things. Here's another map that I made. It shows you just the potential, really just sort of the fact that you can have a 2-2 split in theory. You can have, Mark Gambity's district right here, which extends further down because the region is growing more slowly than Las Vegas and Clark County. And then you can also have a district that is also Republican leaning that takes in the rest of these rural counties, namely Esmeralda, Nye, and Lincoln, and then takes in more Republican neighborhoods of Clark County and Las Vegas. For instance, you have Centennial, which is sort of this block right here. It's fairly Republican leaning. You have communities in Henderson as well, going down past Harry Reid's home of Searchlight to Laughlin and Bullhead City, which is a small community metropolitan area. And that would be a pretty strongly Republican district. And so while it isn't overwhelmingly so, it would remain pretty stably Republican. But if you want to have something like that, you also have to have a mildly Democratic district. And that's what I drew here, taking in some more marginally Democratic areas, even some Republican suburbs, but it's offset by some of these inner areas, which are very blue. Finally, this first district I have drawn here basically is one of the most Democratic iterations of such that I was able to make. I've been making a lot of maps of Nevada, and so this is probably one of the most Democratic ones I could make. And you can see that it's almost 70% Democratic in 2016. Even then, it's not a majority Hispanic. It's in essence a majority minority district, but it's not majority Hispanic. Another map
if I look at that number right there, it seems like for the Black community, for example, it's a large portion, as well as the Asian community. There's a large Asian contingent of people in the Las Vegas area.
Right, exactly. And actually, in the current map, the third district, which is more suburban, more wealthy in general than the fourth, actually has a higher proportion of Asian American citizens. I believe it's somewhere around 15% in the current iteration of maps. But yeah, there's Las Vegas and Clark County in general are relatively, very diverse. And so they have large proportions of African Americans and Hispanic Americans, but also Asian Americans, a lot of whom are from the Philippines, in fact. And so you'll get a lot of that type of representation. I can show you in Las Vegas. So just, a lot of different colors here. It's quite a diverse area. Here's another map I would say that this is also a relatively fair map in terms of having a 2-2 split. You have the Amity district up here, not a surprise, extends more down into some of the more nearby outskirts of Las Vegas. But you also have a pretty solidly Republican district solely within Clark County. And that's interesting too.
And that's interesting.
So I think it brings me to another, I think, critical observation of Nevada politics. And that is that it's not just the rural areas or even the North in general that bring Republican votes. No, you're going to have a lot of Republican support in Clark County to be viable. For instance, back in 2008, when John McCain lost the state in a landslide, almost by 15%, if you actually look at the current drawing of maps, he would have lost a second that only extended so far down south because he did really badly in Washoe County. But you can actually draw a district solely within Clark County that is a McCain district. So I've done that before. I don't have it here, but I'd definitely be willing to prove that. I don't know how the 2020 precinct lines might have affected it, but you can actually draw a McCain district that is solely confined within Clark County. And so it really shows you just how many of those crucial Republican votes are from Clark County. And I think that brings us to a broader point, which is that the nexus of Republican support in Nevada, I think, really is shifting southward. And I think that what you're seeing with a lot of these new candidates and a lot of the new political trends that are showing up in the state in favor of Republicans is that a lot of times they are originating from Clark County and not from Washoe County or from the rural north. I just think that's something that's really interesting to observe as we look into very competitive races in the future in Nevada, which I'm sure will happen.
And definitely, I mean, President Trump's performance in Clark County, he got around 44% of the vote in the county, is the best since Bush in 2000 when he carried the state. It's worth keeping a note on. It's obviously there's changes otherwhere, population growth, to make that a little bit different than in 2000. But there's a big Republican bloc there. It's a big county, and there's a lot of voters there.
Yeah, and so I think I also say that to sort of dispel the notion that it's just rural Republicans who constitute the Nevada Republican Party. That's not at all true. It's actually very suburban and very concentrated within these metropolitan areas like Las Vegas. And then the final map, just to show you something interesting, is that this has sort of the traditional Amity second district. It has sort of this chunk of the first district that's sort of similar. If you do something like that, and you look at the 2016 presidential results, you'll find that the remaining areas are roughly evenly split, actually leaning towards a Trump victory. So you look at these two districts, when you combine them, obviously Trump narrowly wins them. And it shows you that Trump still has, in 2016, but this also extends to 2022, is that Trump still has a lot of suburban support in these areas of Las Vegas. And I had this map specifically up, not just to show you that, but also to show you how the third and the fourth districts have diverged in the way that they trend relative to the state. So this is the 2016 result. You can see that the more suburban, more affluent third district, which is also more concentrated, voted just slightly to the left of this district, the fourth. But if you pull up the 2018 senatorial race, where Jackie Rosen really performed well in the Las Vegas suburbs, you'll see just a massive departure in performance there, where Jackie Rosen did significantly better in the third district than the fourth. And so when the 2020 data comes out in Days Redistricting in terms of Nevada, what I'll definitely be interested to see is, do we have a red fourth district here and then a blue leaning third district? And I think that's very possible. So those two districts have really departed in terms of the way that they trend, because one is much more minority heavy, generally takes in more urban and rural areas. So there's sort of a bifurcation there that benefits Republicans. Whereas the suburban district, which is generally more white, more affluent, while it hasn't shifted massively towards Democrats, in terms of its relation to the state, it has become more favorable to Democrats. So I will stop sharing.
Perfect. And I have one map as well. It's very similar to the ones that Jared put up. This is just kind of a least change that I kind of worked around to just get an idea of the process. And I'll do a little bit of a useful comparison here as well. So I'll put up the original lines from the previous decade. So these are the current lines. If you look at the previous congressional lines, you'll notice basically where this splits off. As it splits off, I believe that's around Lyon County, right there.
Right.
Yeah, it splits off around Nye County, and it doesn't contain White Pine as well. The previous congressional map, obviously the second, included this large area right here, and then these large areas spreading into Nye County. Now, granted, this portion of Nye County has virtually no voters because virtually nobody lives there, but it just gives you an idea of the population shift we're talking about. And I did draw a little bit of a couple changes here. This is very much a light Democratic map, I think. You'll notice the changes here are marginal, but they do make a difference. So basically, what I managed to do here was to take the fourth district. This becomes a Biden plus or a Clinton plus 4 seat. I took in a lot more of these Democratic areas, like these hugely Democratic portions right here, which really overwhelm the rest of the seat. And then the third as well, I snaked it up around this portion of around Las Vegas, and it gets to be only a Trump plus a 0.3% seat, which again, compared to the current map, I believe it was a Trump plus 1 seat last time. So both of these become marginally more Democratic, and the first retains its current form as a majority minority seat that a Democrat would easily win. Although it's a little bit less. Although obviously you look at the votes here, 62 to 33. Compare that to the current map, I believe it was more 66 to 32 is what the existing first district looked like. So it's a little bit of a shift to the right in the district, obviously, but that's just because it's spreading out some of those voters into the more competitive districts of the state. But yeah, overall, that's Nevada. Really interesting state to go over, and I think we'll probably spend the most time on tonight. It's definitely to keep an eye on. Obviously, most of our viewers are probably familiar with some of the woes that have been going on in the Nevada Democratic Party. The Republican Party is just as inept as the new Democratic leadership would be. But it's going to be interesting to see how this goes into 2022 when the state did trend narrowly to the right. There is evidence of a reversion in the most populous portion of the state. And obviously, Republicans are wanting to take back, in particular, the Senate seat there, but also other statewide offices and congressional districts. So even, Democrats will have to be careful in how they draw the map, lest they get in a situation where they've split themselves too thin and end up with a 3-1 map, which is what they wouldn't want for sure. And it's one that can happen even with Democratic-leaning seats, as we saw back in 2014, with the Hershford seat having been represented by a Republican at that point. But the next state we'll go into is New Hampshire, and New Hampshire is a really interesting state. We're not going to spend too much time on New Hampshire because it's fairly simple. I imagine the maps that we've developed will be fairly basic, but it's interesting in that it's probably going to be a little bit of a change for New Hampshire congressional maps. So this is the current map. New Hampshire has 2 seats. Has the first, which is these coastal area portions, the seacoast, along with areas like Manchester, and then stretching up here. This is the more traditionally Republican portion of the state. The second is this more rural district, and it's the more Democratic of the two. Both districts are basically roughly opposite in terms of where they lie in the state, but given New Hampshire is a fairly politically evenly divided state, with the exception of the 2020 presidential election, it's no surprise that one is narrowly more Republican-leaning than national and more Democratic-leaning than national, although both of these districts are represented by Democrats. What is interesting is that this map has existed in its basic form since the 70s. The district has been barely changed at all, and that may be changing soon. For one, this previous map does have some problems. In particular, Coos County is not a great fit for the second anymore, but Republicans are also going to want to draw a more Republican-leaning seat, and they've, luckily for them, they have control of the government. Chris Sununu won a sweeping landslide victory as governor in 2020, enough so he was able to flip both houses of the legislature back and the executive council. So Republicans this decade will have control of redistricting, which is a benefit for them. They did not have that benefit the last time it was drawn because of a Democratic governor. So what does that mean for them? Well, it means they can draw a district that's in theory more compact, in theory fairly competitive, but in practice will be one that's much more favorable to Republicans than before. So this is the baseline map I drew here. With the second district now takes in Coos County, takes in portions of Grafton County on both ends, and it's a district that even in 2020, it would have only gone to Joe Biden by around 2 points, and that's while Joe Biden was winning the state by a very large margin of closer to 7 points. In 2016, the seat would have voted for Trump by around 5 points and would have voted for Sununu in 2018, which was a fairly competitive race, by closer to 13 points. So even without drawing an egregious gerrymander, they could easily draw a more competitive district for themselves in the second. This, of course, makes the first a much less viable target for them. Although Sununu did manage to win it in 2018, it would definitely be a little bit of a difference from their existing map here. I don't know if Jared has any additional maps or anything to add here, but I think that's probably the more likely scenario we see here, where you see a little bit of a shift from that traditional map, which honestly is due for an upgrade in some forms. But obviously, Chris Pappas would not be happy with that, as his district would become much more Republican, and as a result, much more likely to flip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're a Republican in the state, unlike in 2010, when Republicans were able to win both, congressional districts, I don't think that a lot of Republicans would want to have two relatively competitive districts anymore, because it almost ensures that at least one of them will be represented by Democrat, if not both of them, which has been the case for the past few years. And so I think that a lot of Republicans would be yearning for a much more polarized map, where you have a district that is much more safely Republican. On the contrary, that would produce a safely Democratic district, but I think that that would be a risk that a lot of people would be willing to take. And so I have a map, and all it does is it shows just how you can make two very polarized districts, and ones that are not really competitive in any form, because it is possible, even though it's a relatively small state. So if you look at this map, for example, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it. I pulled it up right here.
Right. So what this map does is that it just shows you the fact that you can have two very polarized districts. And so even though this is showing the 2020 presidential results, and because Biden did a lot better than Trump here, the Democratic district is much more safely Democratic than the Republican district is Republican. Mm-hmm. However, you go back to other races like Governor 2020, Chris Sununu wins both of them easily. You go back to the presidential race of 2016, pretty much evenly split, because Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump got, roughly even in the state. But you can have a district that does this. And I think that, in my opinion, the best way to go about this is to try to maximize the potential of having Republican precincts in areas within the Republican district. And for me, that means having an internal Republican district where, you have like these coastal areas in Portsmouth, even going up north, going to Lebanon, where Dartmouth, and Hanover, where Dartmouth is, going to Concord and Manchester and Nashua. Save that all for Democrats, but you have an internal district that takes in a lot of this historically Republican region that goes along the Massachusetts border. You have some of the more inner areas that are now, pretty Republican leaning, and then it goes up north. And that, I think, is how you would try to maximize Republican support in a Republican leaning district here, which is very possible, as I've said.
Yeah. And again, I do expect Republicans to draw a more favorable map for themselves here. The existing split really, again, it's been there since the 70s. It probably is due for an upgrade in some form regardless. Drawing in Coos County, I think, is an absolute guarantee that they're going to do that. That county is Republican leaning at this point. There's really no reason for them to put it in a Democratic leaning district. That alone makes the first, or the second, I should say, much more viable for them. Obviously, that would be a sea change, though, because back in 2014 and in 2012, they did contest the second district, or the first district, I should say. They had a Republican candidate they tried to tout really well, Marilinda Garcia. They tried to run her in the first as a new brand of a Republican candidate. She didn't win, but they did contest the seat. Whereas in the future, obviously, if they draw themselves a more viable second district, they would not be contesting that first district. It just wouldn't be something they would be worth the time or effort to do, even if a Republican like Chris Sununu could carry almost any iteration of that district. It's just something that would probably be, in all likelihood, something we'd see going forward. And I don't think it would be surprising to see that, especially given Republicans do, as I said, have control of redistricting for the first time in a fairly long time, at least a couple decades of having either a split legislature or something else along that line. But yeah, that's New Hampshire, which is really going to be an interesting one to watch. This is one of the best opportunities Republicans have to gain an easy a relatively easy pickup, I should say. Obviously, a Biden plus two district is still a Biden plus two district, but at a baseline, it's much more competitive down ballot, especially compared to 2016 than previous iterations of the map. And you can draw something far worse that doesn't look that much, that much more awful, I should say. But yeah, the final state we have to go over here is another state in the West, New Mexico. New Mexico is going to be really interesting to watch. It's kind of been a roller coaster ride watching New Mexico. For those who are unfamiliar with the state, this used to be a very competitive state. In recent years, thanks to growth in Albuquerque and increasing Democratic support with Hispanic voters, the state saw a more decisive shift to the left. It's voted Democratic in every presidential election since 2008, and it's also voted for governor, Democrats in 2018 after 2 terms of a Hispanic Latina Republican governor. 2020 again was a good year for New Mexico Democrats at the presidential level. Down ballot, that was a little bit more disappointing for them, especially in the Senate race, where they won the presidential race in New Mexico by around 11 points, but the Senate race they only won by 6. They had a very credible Republican candidate who did very well in the state and only lost the state by 6 points, despite being relatively underfunded. This is he lost the state 51.7 to 45.6, which is very, very respectable, especially his performance in the more conservative, Latino-heavy southern portion of the state. So going into the cycle as well, the Republican candidate in the 3rd district, or sorry, I should say the 2nd district, Yvette Harrell, managed to flip the seat back. In a surprise, somewhat of an upset. That was generally considered a race that was more favorable to the incumbent Democrat, who I would try to pronounce her name, but I am horrible with pronouncing her name, so I was not going to try. But after the election, Democrats openly mused about getting rid of Yvette Harrell. They openly mused about drawing a gerrymander that would result in 3 safely Democratic seats. For whatever reason, the momentum appears to have changed in New Mexico. They recently passed under new law an independent commission that will be drawing or at least providing input on the congressional districts. It's not complete independence from the legislature, as you can see here. It seems more of an advisory role, but it does reduce the possibility that they would draw a hardcore gerrymander here, because there's no reason to create a commission and then just ignore the commission. That's just bad PR, especially in a state like New Mexico, which is prone for a little bit of a Republican resurgence demographically, especially with Latino voters. The current map, we'll kind of go over it here real quick, is the 1st district is most of Albuquerque, this is a more traditionally Republican district, or was held by Republican Heather Wilson until 2008, but it's become very Democratic in recent years. The seat is open. There will be a special election to fill it. It's not anticipated to be competitive, but if Republicans manage to pull within 10 percentage points in this district, something like a 55 to 45 defeat would be a pretty good sign for them going forward, given the Democratic strength in Albuquerque. The 2nd is an interesting district. It's nominally Hispanic in population, and it's also quite Republican at the presidential level, but it's had a tendency to vote for more conservative blue dog Democrats, namely in 2010 and in 2018, both of which were immediately dispatched in the following presidential election. Finally, the 3rd contains one of the larger Native American populations in the country for a district. It stretches some of the more conservative counties like San Juan, which is a very Republican area of the state, but also draws in a lot of these rural areas. Los Alamos, which is in particular very college-educated, very Democratic at this point, and is the most solidly Democratic district in the state. It's currently represented by first-termer Tessa Fernandez, who is definitely more of a new type of Democrat in New Mexico. She's a very progressive Democrat who's not as open to resource extraction and fossil fuels, which are obviously a very big portion of how New Mexico pays for its budget. If you look at previous map draws, you'll notice that they've been stuck at 3 districts for the last few decades, but the 1st district, focusing on Albuquerque, has continued to shrink each decade. And I don't think that will be expected to happen less this time. I do think the 1st will be a little bit more geographically compact. But obviously the real question is whether or not the 2nd becomes more competitive. We've had multiple conflicting signals here. You have the Speaker of the House saying they wanted to draw Yvette Harrell out, very conservative Republican, representing a nominally competitive seat. At the same time, they can't irritate the tribes. If they split the reservations up, the tribes will be justifiably very angry. at diluting their voting power. And they also can't split too much of the first off, otherwise that becomes more competitive. Because as the first becomes more Republican, the second becomes more Democratic. They can make the second a little bit more Democratic. But if they make them both even, you have a situation where Republicans could flip to 2 seats. So what are your kind of thoughts before we go into kind of our maps here as to what we're likely to see, going forward in the state?
Yeah, so I think that Democrats who are openly pushing for a 3-0 map after election were smart to at least somewhat stave off that proposition, because I think that in the long run it could bode harmfully for them, as we saw in the
Mm-hmm.
Senate race that you mentioned uh, Ben Ray Lujan winning by a fairly underwhelming margin against Mark Ronchetti. Lujan actually won the third district by almost exactly the same margin as Ronchetti won the second district. It was really only the first district that was able to give Ben Ray Lujan a relatively comfortable margin of around 6%. And so I think that if Democrats, are so willing to try to create a 3-0 map, it could backfire on them, especially if Republican gains among Latinos continue. And so I think that,
Mm-hmm.
Even though Biden did do better than Hillary Clinton in terms of margin in the state in 2016, Trump made massive gains in the southern region of the state, which is, talking about a very oil-heavy region of the state that was
Mm-hmm.
kind of concerned about the tone coming from the Democratic side about trying to switch to more renewable sources of energy. And so I would
Mm-hmm.
say, keeping a Republican district there, that would probably even become more Republican with time, would allow Democrats to have some leeway and some latitude in creating 2 very solidly Democratic districts in the northern part of the state, one of which centered
Mm-hmm.
around Bernalillo County with Albuquerque.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you mentioned with the resource extraction, because this wasn't just a trend in New Mexico. We saw adjacent portions in Texas, already Republican areas, but with heavy Hispanic populations, uniformly swing Republican. Even as many other urban areas in the state trended more Democratic. That was not something that was expected. Obviously, no one, if anyone had told you going into 2020 that we expected Latinos to vote more for Trump than they had in the previous election, you probably would have been laughed out of the room, and justifiably so, based on even if you look at some of the details, it was just not expected. There really are, though, a couple ways that Democrats could draw. I think I'll go ahead and show my maps here in a second, but I think one of the more underrated possibilities is of not even trying to make the second competitive, just making it a vote sink. Trying to make it, so it shores up their other 2 seats by giving Republicans a much more Republican leaning second district. This is something that would be obviously not great for Democrats who wanted to run the state and to have a complete hold on things. But from a strategic perspective, it would probably make a lot more sense just going forward to try to at least consider you know seeding some of these areas. It's really, really unwise to stretch yourself too thin. As we've seen with dummy manders before in the past, there is a risk when you're drawing districts that you simply overextend your reach and results in situations that nobody wants, at least when they're drawing gerrymanders, where their gerrymander defeats itself. They have an opportunity here to really provide a more solid hold, on the state. And it would be a little bit short-sighted, in my opinion, for them to go straight for a overwhelming, fire and brimstone Republican map. It really would just be a bit unwise, in my opinion. Just kind of mirroring what what Jared said here. But I'll go ahead and show my maps. I've got 2. The first one is more of a least change map again, and then the second one is a more traditional, or is a more Republican leaning map. I should say it's where the Republicans are packed into the second district here. So this first map is very similar to the current one. I try to make a least change sort of thing. There are a little bit of borders, a few areas that need to be changed, shifted around just for various reasons. For example, giving the third some of these native communities right here, stretching this more into here, and then cutting out one county out of the second due to population reasons. The end result here is that it's a Trump plus 14 district, and then the other 2 districts are the third in particular is is Clinton plus 19, and then the first is Clinton plus 16. So Democrats would be pretty comfortable in all of these seats. Although obviously in a more competitive election, the third in particular being more rural could be a little bit of a problem for them. The other potential map is this one right here, which basically correlates pretty cleanly with the presidential results. And what do I mean by that? Well, look at these counties up here. These are all very, very Republican counties that are currently in a Democratic district. By simply taking them out of that district and putting them into the second, you create a district that is Trump plus 15. And again, it cleans up some of those portions, but it also leaves these other ones. In particular, this first is Biden or is Clinton plus 17, but the third also becomes Clinton plus 19. Again, very, very competitive seats, high Native American population again, because the reservations are kept intact here. So this is one that would be much more favorable to the incumbent Republican, Yvette Harrell, but also kind of shores up these more vulnerable Democrats, relatively speaking. Although to see either of these districts be competitive would be kind of a surprise in my opinion. Although I guess if the state is somewhat competitive, you would see those two districts be a little more competitive. Going forward, I'll go ahead and let Jared, kind of show his maps or his map and kind of give a little bit more input on the state before we wrap up tonight.
Sure. So I made a map that actually splits Bernalillo County for the sake of having 3 solidly Democratic districts. So again, I think that this is a precarious move if Democrats in New Mexico want to pursue this. Nonetheless, we'll have to see what they choose to do. And so, if they decide to do something like this, then it would behoove them, I think, to try to lend areas of Democratic support along with all these different districts. Can you see that, Eric?
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. So as you can see here, again, I decided to split up Bernalillo County, home to Albuquerque, Democratic stronghold these days, into all 3 of these communities. This is not a map that I would support at all, not only given the fact that it dilutes Republican votes, but I think that having a very strongly Democratic district up north to consume, a lot of these Hispano communities, but as well as Native American communities, which I could deem to be communities of interest, I think that would be in the best interests of both Democrats and Republicans who are trying to ensure representation. And then I also think that the prerogatives and the necessities of folks living down here in the southern part of the state do necessitate their having their own strongly Republican district. And then, by process of deduction, you would have a district that is centered along Bernalillo County, perhaps taking in some of the nearby counties, but really sort of centered on the city of Albuquerque. But again, if Democrats decide a 3-0 map, this would be, I think, a sure way for them to ensure Democratic support that withstands Republican waves in these districts. But again, I don't think that would be wise for them. I think that a 2-1 map that shores up Republican support, that does something like what Eric did with sort of swooping into these northeastern areas of the state, taking them in, and then just having something of a Republican vote sink. I think that would be really wise for Democrats to do so that they can have a lot of leeway with their own 2 districts in the state.
And obviously, given New Mexico's Democratic lean, any fair or neutral map of the state would be a 2-1 map. The question is just how much that second district would be, would not be competitive. The median district in the state, I should say. But yeah, it's really interesting state. Again, this is what I'm going to want to keep an eye on going into 2022 to see if there's any trends. Obviously, there is a gubernatorial election. The incumbent governor actually is kind of embroiled in a scandal right now of sorts regarding a cover-up of sexual assault allegations or something along that line, which is not great. But the state's Democratic lean and strong presence in Albuquerque in particular should be enough to carry them. But if they get a little bit nervous, get a little bit skittish, expect something more like the one I drew, the second one with the more Republican northeastern corner, being added in there just as a little bit of insurance to make sure their other 2 candidates hold on, especially if Republicans somehow manage to have an upset in the first district, which is not likely at all. To be clear, that would be along the lines of an Alabama 2018 sort of victory. You would not expect it. I would not expect it. I think a competitive, if Republicans get 45%, it would be a good night for them. But that's one to keep an eye on, even though these states aren't necessarily the most competitive. They do provide opportunities for both parties to benefit in this redistricting reapportionment, especially with some of the undercount in particular that's been involved in some of these areas, we're not actually sure how accurate these population estimates will even be. That's what we're kind of going off of when we're drawing these. There is a substantial undercount, it seems like, in places like Arizona, to some degree Nevada, New Mexico, places like that. So keep that, again, with a little bit of a grain of salt there. But yeah, thank you all for watching. Thank you, Jared, for coming on. Really appreciate your insight, especially into Nevada. Um, Always good to see that level of detail for a state that people kind of tend to dismiss a little bit or put it in a lower tier than like the Michigans or the Wisconsins or Pennsylvanias, North Carolinas in terms of competitive states. Next week we'll be covering we'll be covering either New York, New Jersey, or both. We're still trying to figure out the details there. We may even skip New Jersey because there was such a substantial the estimates were so hilariously off in New Jersey that it may not even be worth drawing congressional districts under the estimates because they're closer to gaining a congressional district than anyone thought they would. We're talking a major underestimate there. So we'll keep you posted on whether or not we do New York or New Jersey, or just kind of skip over them and go to a state with a more reliable estimate. But again, thank you guys for watching. If you like what we do, be sure to visit our website, electionsdaily.com. You can find us on Twitter. You'll have me at DE Cunningham too. And you can find Jared Stone at JStonePolitics. And if you really like what we do, you can support us on our Patreon page. I believe you have a link on the website somewhere. It's new. We're just getting started with it and starting to roll out some of the benefits next month. Whether or not you like that or not, we're happy that you like our show, that you subscribe, and we'll see you on next week's edition of Redistricting Radar. Thank you.